Hi guys, night still rested over the valley of the Nile when the first sounds of the day began to stir. Far above the riverbanks, the stars remained scattered across the dark sky, bright and silent above the sleeping fields. The air was cool for a little while longer. Soon the heat would return, rising from the sand and stone, but now there was only stillness. In the distance, narrow paths crossed between clusters of mud-brick homes. Their walls carried the color of the earth itself, shaped by hands that had mixed river mud with straw many years before. Flat roofs rested quietly beneath the fading stars. Small courtyards sat empty. Clay jars stood against walls. Baskets leaned beside wooden doors. Inside one of these homes, a family still slept. The room was simple. Mats woven from reeds covered the floor. A low lamp had burned through much of the night, leaving only a faint scent of oil in the air. The darkness inside was softer than the darkness outside, warmed by the closeness of bodies resting after long hours of labor. A builder lay on his side beneath a thin linen cloth. His hands were rough from years of carrying stone beneath the sun. Fine dust remained in the lines of his skin, though he had washed in the river the evening before. Beside him, his wife slept lightly, already half awake as she listened to the quiet sounds of the settlement around them. Beyond the walls, someone coughed. A donkey shifted its weight. Farther away, somewhere near the riverbank, an oar touched water. Ancient Egypt is often remembered through its great monuments. The mind drifts toward enormous temples, towering statues, and vast pyramids rising from the desert. Yet beneath those grand shapes lived millions of ordinary people whose names disappeared long ago. Their days were filled not with royal ceremonies but with work, hunger, family, and rest. Their world was built from simple routines repeated under the same sun year after year. Long before dawn, the first workers began to wake. The woman in the small house sat up carefully so as not to disturb the youngest child sleeping nearby. She wrapped herself in linen and stepped into the courtyard. Above her, the eastern sky showed the faintest hint of pale blue. She moved quietly through familiar tasks. A clay bowl sat beside the wall. A basket of grain waited beneath a cloth. The family had eaten bread every day for as long as anyone could remember. Bread filled stomachs before labor and comforted tired bodies after sunset. It was plain and coarse, but it carried people through the endless rhythm of work. She poured grain onto a grinding stone and began to push the heavy upper stone back and forth. The sound was soft. Stone against stone. Again. And again. Across the settlement, other women had begun the same task. Before the builders reached the quarries, before fishermen lowered their nets, before scribes unrolled their papyrus, bread had to be prepared. The stars slowly faded. A child stirred awake and rubbed sleep from his eyes. He watched his mother work in the dim light and listened to the steady scraping of stone. For him, this sound belonged to morning itself. Outside, the settlement gradually filled with movement. Men stepped from their homes carrying sandals in their hands. Some stretched their stiff backs. Others sat briefly against walls, gathering strength before the long day ahead. Their bodies carried the memory of years spent lifting, digging, rowing, and hauling beneath the heavy sky of Egypt. Many people imagine ancient workers living in constant drama and suffering, but most days were quieter than that. Their lives unfolded through repetition. Each sunrise brought familiar duties. Each evening brought the same exhaustion. The builder finally rose from his mat. He crossed the courtyard and washed his face with cool water stored in a clay jar. The shock of the cold water pulled him fully into the morning. He ate a piece of bread while standing in silence. Nearby, his oldest son tied a simple belt around his linen garment. Neither spoke very much. Words came slowly before dawn. The family had followed this pattern for years. Soon the streets between the houses filled with footsteps. Workers gathered in small groups, carrying tools made from wood, stone, and copper. Their conversations remained quiet. Some spoke of the weather. Others wondered how high the river would rise that year. A few simply walked in silence, saving their strength. The settlement itself had grown beside one of Egypt's great building sites. Nearby, teams of laborers cut stone, shaped blocks, and carried materials across the desert ground. Their work supported projects that would outlive them by thousands of years, though most of them could never have imagined such distant futures. For these workers, life remained immediate. There was bread to earn, children to feed, sandals to repair, a roof to strengthen before the next season. The sky brightened. Birds gathered along the riverbanks. The Nile moved steadily through the land, carrying life from the south toward the sea. Villages and cities depended upon its water. Fields depended upon its floods. Entire generations shaped their lives around its changing moods. At the edge of the settlement, fishermen prepared their boats. The boats were narrow and simple, built from wood and reeds. Nets lay piled beside them, still damp from the previous day's work. The fishermen moved with practiced ease, checking knots and ropes without needing to think. One older fisherman paused to watch the sun rise. He had spent most of his life beside the river. His father had done the same. His grandfather as well. The river marked the seasons more clearly than any calendar. It told people when to plant, when to harvest, when to travel, and when to wait. As the sun climbed higher, the fishermen pushed their boats into the water. The sound of wood sliding over wet earth echoed softly across the bank. The river welcomed them. Mist drifted above the surface. Gentle ripples spread outward from the oars. Palm trees stood motionless in the morning light. Farther inland, farmers had already begun their own work. Ancient Egypt depended not only upon kings and priests but upon countless laborers who bent over fields from sunrise until evening. They planted barley and wheat. They dug irrigation channels. They carried baskets filled with mud. They watched the sky and worried about the flood waters. A farmer walked slowly beside his field, examining the soil beneath his feet. The earth felt damp from the river's gift. Nearby, oxen waited patiently, their breath visible in the cool dawn air. Wooden tools rested against a wall. Children followed behind their parents, learning tasks that would shape the rest of their lives. For many families, childhood passed quickly. Young boys learned to carry water, repair fences, and guide animals. Girls learned to grind grain, weave cloth, and prepare food. There was little separation between learning and labor. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next through ordinary moments. The days moved according to necessity. Back near the builder's settlement, the road toward the quarry had become crowded. Groups of men walked together across the dusty ground. Sandals slapped against stone. Voices rose and faded. Someone laughed quietly at a familiar story. Another man adjusted the cloth covering his head against the coming heat. The quarry waited beneath the brightening sky. Here, workers spent endless hours cutting stone from the earth. The work demanded patience and strength. Copper tools struck against rock. Wooden sledges scraped across the ground. Dust settled onto skin and clothing. The builder from the small house joined his team. He knew every face. Years of labor had created friendships stronger than many words could express. These men had shared meals, injuries, and long afternoons beneath the burning sun. They understood each other's silences. The foreman arrived shortly after sunrise. He carried a staff and a list prepared by scribes. Work had to be organized carefully. Egypt's great projects depended upon order. Stone blocks had to reach the correct places. Supplies had to be counted. Workers had to receive food and water. The scribes occupied a different world from the laborers, though their lives were also shaped by routine. One young scribe sat beneath a simple shelter at the edge of the site. His reed pen rested beside sheets of papyrus. His fingers were stained with ink. While others carried stone, he carried numbers and names. He recorded deliveries. He counted workers. He measured grain. His education had required years of practice. As a child, he had spent long days copying symbols beneath the watchful eyes of teachers. The lessons had been difficult. Mistakes brought correction. Progress came slowly. Now, as a grown man, he enjoyed certain comforts unknown to many laborers. His hands remained smooth. His back ached less at the end of the day. Yet his life was not free from burdens. The pressure to keep accurate records weighed heavily upon him. Officials expected precision. Supplies could not disappear. Mistakes carried consequences. He dipped his pen into ink and began another day's work. Around him, the quarry awakened fully. The first blows of copper against stone echoed across the desert. The sound repeated steadily. Metal striking rock. Dust rising. Voices calling. The sun climbed higher. Hours passed in careful labor. For the workers, time moved differently beneath the heat. The morning stretched outward. Muscles tightened. Sweat gathered along brows and necks. Sand found its way into sandals and clothing. Yet there were moments of quiet beauty hidden within the hardship. A breeze crossing the quarry. The shadow of a bird passing overhead. The cool taste of water shared between friends. Ancient life was not entirely sorrowful, nor was it easy. Most days existed somewhere between comfort and exhaustion. As the sun approached its highest point, workers paused to eat. They sat in small groups beneath patches of shade. Bread emerged from cloth bundles. On fortunate days there might be onions, dates, or dried fish. Water jars passed from hand to hand. Conversation returned. Men spoke of children learning to walk. They worried about aging parents. They discussed repairs needed at home. One worker mentioned the rising cost of sandals in the market. Another complained about pain in his shoulder. These simple concerns filled their lives more completely than the distant actions of kings. Not far away, merchants arranged goods in a busy market street. The market smelled of grain, fish, smoke, leather, and dust warmed by sunlight. Vendors called softly to passing customers. Baskets overflowed with vegetables. Potters displayed jars of every shape and size. A woman carrying a child stopped to examine woven cloth. An old man traded onions for oil. Two boys ran between stalls before disappearing into the crowd. Markets connected the many layers of Egyptian society. Farmers arrived with harvests. Fishermen brought their catch from the river. Craftsmen sold tools and pottery. News traveled along these streets as quickly as goods. Stories moved from village to village. People spoke of changing floodwaters, distant temples, and taxes demanded by officials. Rumors drifted through the market like smoke. Yet most conversations returned to familiar subjects. Food. Family. Work. Weather. As afternoon settled over the land, the heat deepened. Stone walls radiated warmth. Roads shimmered beneath the sun. Workers wiped sweat from their faces and continued their tasks. The endless brightness of Egypt shaped every life. In the workshops near the settlement, craftsmen bent over their labor. A carpenter smoothed rough wood with careful hands. Nearby, another worker repaired broken furniture. The smell of sawdust mixed with smoke from cooking fires. Across the room, a young apprentice struggled to copy his teacher's movements. His hands lacked experience. He worked slowly. The older craftsman offered few words. Instruction often came through observation. Skills passed quietly from master to student over many years. Outside, the world glowed beneath the afternoon sun. Children sought shade beneath walls. Dogs slept beside doorways. Women carried water jars balanced carefully upon their heads. Inside homes, preparations for evening had already begun. Grain was ground once more. Fires were lit. Clay ovens warmed. The rhythm of daily life continued without pause. For many Egyptians, illness formed an ordinary part of existence. Bodies worn down by labor often carried pain. Cuts became infected. Teeth decayed from coarse bread filled with grains of sand and stone dust from the grinding process. The builder sometimes woke with aching joints long before old age arrived. His wife worried over fevers that visited their children during the hottest months. Herbal remedies offered comfort, though not always relief. Ancient medicine blended careful observation with belief and tradition. Healers prepared mixtures from plants, honey, oils, and minerals. Prayers accompanied treatments. Families hoped for recovery and accepted uncertainty. Life remained fragile. The river gave life, but disease traveled through villages as well. Heat exhausted workers. Accidents occurred at quarries and construction sites. Yet people endured. Morning followed morning. Season followed season. Children grew taller. Parents grew older. The Nile continued its slow journey northward. As afternoon faded, shadows lengthened across the settlement. Workers returned from the quarries in tired groups. Their clothes carried dust from the day's labor. Their shoulders sagged with exhaustion. Still, there was comfort in the familiar sight of home appearing beyond the road. The builder recognized his house from a distance. Smoke drifted from the courtyard. He could hear voices inside. The simple joy of returning home after work belonged to ancient people just as deeply as it belongs to anyone. He stepped through the doorway. His youngest child ran toward him. His wife handed him water. He sat upon a low stool and removed his sandals. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence itself felt peaceful. Soon evening meals filled the small house with warmth. Bread rested on woven mats. Bowls of vegetables sat nearby. On fortunate evenings, there might be fish from the river or a little beer brewed from grain. The family ate together. They discussed the day. The children described small adventures. The builder listened with tired eyes. Outside, neighbors gathered in courtyards of their own. Night approached slowly. The heat loosened its grip. A breeze drifted through narrow streets. Above the settlement, the sky turned shades of gold and deep blue. Some families climbed onto flat rooftops after sunset. The cooler air offered relief after the long day. People sat together beneath the stars and shared quiet conversation. An old grandmother told stories remembered from her own childhood. A father repaired a sandal strap. Children watched the moon rise over the desert. Far beyond the villages and fields, enormous monuments stood in silence. Yet the true heart of Egypt beat here, in these ordinary evenings. It lived in bread ovens glowing after sunset. It lived in tired workers washing dust from their hands. It lived in mothers preparing meals and fathers returning home. The greatness of ancient Egypt rested upon countless lives that history rarely remembers. As darkness deepened, lamps flickered inside the homes. Oil burned softly. Shadows moved across mud-brick walls. The builder stretched out upon his mat. His muscles still carried the memory of stone and sunlight. Nearby, his children settled into sleep one by one. Outside, footsteps faded. The market had gone quiet. Boats rocked gently against the riverbank. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then fell silent. The stars returned above the Nile. Tomorrow would look much like today. Before dawn, grain would be ground again. Workers would rise. Fishermen would push their boats into the river. Scribes would sharpen their pens. The cycle would continue, calm and unbroken, carried forward by ordinary people whose names have long since disappeared into the desert wind. And in the quiet hours before sleep fully arrived, ancient Egypt was not a kingdom of monuments and kings, but a world of simple homes, weary hands, warm bread, and the endless rhythm of human life beneath the stars. Before the first pale light touched the eastern horizon, the village remained wrapped in darkness. The river flowed unseen beyond the fields, carrying cool air across the sleeping land. In the silence, the great stone monuments of Egypt seemed distant and unimportant. Their outlines disappeared into the night, while the lives of ordinary people unfolded quietly below them. Inside the mud-brick homes, people rested close together. Families shared small rooms where woven mats covered hard floors and clay jars stood against the walls. The thick bricks held the coolness of the night for a little while longer, protecting those inside from the heat that would soon return. The builder awoke to the sound of someone moving in the courtyard. His eyes opened slowly. For a moment, he remained still, listening to the familiar rhythm of the settlement before dawn. Somewhere nearby, grain was already being ground into flour. A donkey shifted its feet against packed earth. From another house came the soft cry of an infant. He sat up and rubbed the stiffness from his shoulders. Years of labor had changed his body. His hands were broad and rough, his arms strong from lifting stone, but the work left its marks. Some mornings, pain rested deep inside his joints before the day had even begun. His back carried the memory of countless journeys beneath the sun. He stood and stepped outside. The air felt gentle against his skin. Above him, thousands of stars stretched across the sky, untouched by smoke or distant lights. The moon hung low over the western desert. In the faint glow, he could see his wife kneeling beside the grinding stone. She had been awake for some time. Her work, like his, followed the same pattern every day. Long before sunrise, she prepared flour, fetched water, repaired clothing, and organized the small tasks that kept the household alive. Her labor was quieter than the work in the quarry, but it was no less demanding. The heavy stone moved back and forth beneath her hands. She paused only to brush flour from her arms. Nearby, a clay oven waited to be lit. A basket of onions rested against the wall. Small jars held oil, dried herbs, and precious stores of grain. For many Egyptian families, survival depended on careful planning. Food had to last through changing seasons. Clothing had to be repaired again and again. Nothing was wasted if it could still serve a purpose. The builder drank cool water from a clay cup and sat in silence. The world around him slowly awakened. Across the settlement, doors opened. Workers stepped into narrow streets. They greeted one another with quiet nods. There was comfort in familiar faces. These people had grown up together. They had shared festivals, floods, illnesses, and harvests. Some of the older men remembered years when the Nile had risen higher than expected. Others spoke softly of dry seasons that had brought worry to every household. The river gave life, but it also demanded patience. Far away from the villages, deep in the desert, the land seemed empty and endless. Yet along the Nile itself, Egypt was crowded with human activity. Boats moved constantly along the water. Farmers worked the fields. Craftsmen shaped wood and stone. Children carried baskets through dusty roads. The river tied everything together. As dawn approached, fishermen prepared for another day on the water. One small boat drifted away from the shore while darkness still lingered. Two brothers stood inside, arranging their nets with practiced hands. Their father had taught them this work many years earlier, just as his own father had taught him. The younger brother dipped his fingers into the cool water. The Nile felt calm that morning. Mist floated above its surface, blurring the distant shoreline. Birds gathered among reeds along the banks, waiting for the first warmth of the sun. Fishing demanded patience more than strength. Hours passed in silence. Nets had to be repaired carefully. A single tear could ruin an entire day's work. The brothers understood every movement of the river. They knew where fish gathered and where the currents ran strongest. They could read changes in the wind by watching ripples on the water. For them, the Nile was not merely part of the landscape. It was a companion that shaped every season of life. Back in the village, the first bread of the morning was baking. Warm air drifted from clay ovens into the streets. The smell of fresh bread mixed with smoke and dust. Children began to wake, rubbing their eyes as they emerged into courtyards. One small boy sat beside his grandmother while she worked. Her hands moved slowly now. Age had weakened her eyesight and stiffened her fingers, but she still carried memories from decades of life beside the river. She remembered floods that had swallowed fields and years when the harvest had been plentiful. She told stories in a quiet voice. Not stories of kings or distant wars, but stories of ordinary moments. She remembered carrying water as a child. She remembered the sound of sandals on stone streets. She remembered nights spent sleeping beneath the stars during the hottest months of summer. The boy listened while eating his breakfast. For him, the ancient world was not ancient at all. It was simply life. The sky brightened. Light spread slowly across the fields, touching the tops of palm trees and reflecting from the river. Workers gathered along the road leading toward the quarries and workshops. The builder joined them. He carried simple tools made from wood and copper. Around him walked men of different ages. Some were young and eager. Others moved more carefully, protecting old injuries hidden beneath linen clothing. Their journey took them past small gardens and storage buildings. Women swept dust from courtyards. Merchants prepared their stalls. Children chased each other between houses before being called back to help with chores. The settlement itself seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the day. As the sun climbed higher, the quarry came alive once again. Stonecutters spread across the site. Foremen called instructions. Scribes unrolled their papyrus scrolls and checked lists of supplies. The young scribe from the previous day arrived carrying his writing tools in a leather case. He sat beneath a shaded shelter and prepared ink. Although his work spared him from the hardest physical labor, his life remained disciplined. He had risen before dawn to review accounts from the previous week. Mistakes could bring punishment. Grain deliveries had to be recorded correctly. Workers' rations had to be counted. He often watched the laborers in the quarry with mixed feelings. Part of him felt grateful for his education. Another part wondered if his life was truly easier. Long hours bent over papyrus left his neck aching. Endless numbers filled his thoughts even after sunset. Responsibility rested heavily upon him. He dipped his pen into black ink and began writing. Nearby, the sound of hammers echoed across the stone. The work of shaping blocks required extraordinary patience. Men chipped away at rock for hours beneath the sun. Dust settled over everything. The air itself seemed to shimmer with heat. At first, the labor moved steadily. Voices rose above the noise. Tools struck stone. Sand shifted beneath sandals. But as morning passed into afternoon, exhaustion slowly spread among the workers. The heat of Egypt could be overwhelming. It pressed down upon shoulders and backs. It drained strength from even the strongest laborers. Men wrapped cloth around their heads to shield themselves from the sun, yet sweat still soaked their clothing. Water became precious. Every pause beneath a patch of shade brought relief. The builder sat beside his companions during the midday meal. They shared bread and onions while resting against a wall of stone. One man removed his sandals and rubbed his swollen feet. Another leaned back and closed his eyes for a few moments. Their conversation drifted from one subject to another. Someone worried about a sick child at home. Another spoke about repairs needed on his roof before the next flood season. A younger worker asked questions about marriage, listening carefully to the advice of older men. Life moved forward through these small conversations. The great achievements of Egypt depended on such moments, simple exchanges between ordinary people resting in the shade. Beyond the quarry, farmers continued their own endless work. Fields stretched along the riverbanks in neat patterns shaped by generations of labor. Irrigation channels carried water across the land. Men and women bent over crops beneath the afternoon sun. Farming demanded constant attention. Seeds had to be planted at the proper time. Animals required care. Tools needed repair. The success of an entire household depended on the harvest. One farmer walked slowly along an irrigation ditch, checking the flow of water. He carried a wooden tool over his shoulder and paused often to examine the soil. His son followed behind him. The boy had only recently begun helping in the fields, though his education had already started years earlier. He had learned to recognize weather patterns, to understand the changing river, and to respect the hard work that sustained the family. There were few days of complete rest. Even during festivals, some tasks could not be delayed. Animals still needed food. Water still had to be carried. Bread still had to be baked. The rhythm of labor shaped every season. As the afternoon lengthened, merchants in nearby towns welcomed travelers arriving by boat. The Nile served as Egypt's great road. Long wooden vessels carried grain, stone, pottery, cloth, and countless other goods between distant settlements. Sailors adjusted ropes while merchants inspected their cargo. At the docks, the air smelled of wet wood, fish, and river mud. Workers unloaded baskets filled with vegetables and jars sealed with clay. Porters balanced heavy loads across their shoulders as they crossed crowded pathways. Some merchants had traveled for weeks. They brought stories from distant places along the river. News spread quickly among market stalls. People gathered to listen. One traveler described a temple under construction far to the south. Another spoke of unusual flood waters in a neighboring region. Yet for most listeners, such stories remained distant from daily concerns. A mother worried more about feeding her children than about events hundreds of miles away. A laborer cared more about his aching back than about the affairs of nobles. The simple needs of ordinary life remained at the center of their world. As evening approached, the temperature slowly began to fall. Long shadows stretched across the fields. Birds returned to the riverbanks. The workers in the quarry finished their tasks for the day and prepared to leave. The builder washed dust from his face using water from a shared jar. His muscles trembled with fatigue. Around him, other laborers gathered their tools and spoke quietly. The journey home always felt longer than the journey to work. Feet dragged against the road. Conversations grew softer. The day's labor lingered in every movement. Still, there was comfort in the sight of smoke rising from distant homes. Back in the settlement, families prepared the evening meal. Children carried bundles of firewood through narrow streets. Lamps were cleaned and filled with oil. The smell of baking bread drifted through the warm air. Inside one house, a woman sat weaving linen. The work demanded patience and skill. Threads passed carefully through her fingers as she shaped cloth that would eventually become clothing, blankets, or trade goods. Beside her, two daughters watched and learned. The older girl had already begun helping with household tasks. She could grind grain, sweep floors, and carry water from nearby wells. The younger child still treated these duties as a game, though she would soon inherit the same responsibilities. Life in ancient Egypt moved according to quiet expectations. Children became workers. Workers became parents. Parents grew old. The cycle continued. As darkness spread across the land, families gathered together. The builder returned home just as the last light faded from the sky. He sat beside his children and listened to their stories. His wife served bread and vegetables in simple bowls. For a while, the worries of labor disappeared. The small room glowed with lamplight. Outside, neighbors talked in nearby courtyards. Laughter drifted through the night air. Somewhere, music played softly, a simple melody carried by wind between the houses. Festivals and celebrations existed, but most evenings remained modest and peaceful. People repaired tools. They mended clothing. They shared meals and stories. The pace of life slowed after sunset. Without the harsh light of day, the settlement became softer. The streets emptied. Animals settled into sleep. The stars emerged once again above the Nile. On the flat roof of his home, the builder sat alone for a few moments before resting. He looked toward the dark outline of the desert. He could not know that thousands of years later, people would still wonder about his world. He could not imagine distant generations studying the monuments he helped create. His thoughts remained close to home. He thought about tomorrow's work. He thought about his family. He thought about the river and the harvest. A cool breeze crossed the rooftops. The sounds of the village faded one by one. Doors closed softly. Footsteps disappeared. Lamps flickered behind mudbrick walls. And beneath the endless stars of Egypt, countless ordinary people prepared for sleep, carrying into the night the quiet weight of another day lived beside the river. The night deepened over the Nile, and the last voices in the settlement slowly faded into silence. Oil lamps flickered behind mudbrick walls, casting soft shapes across sleeping rooms. Above the flat rooftops, the stars stretched from one horizon to the other, clear and bright in the dry desert air. The river continued its journey through the darkness, moving quietly past villages, fields, and temples whose stone columns stood still beneath the moon. For the people of Egypt, nighttime was never entirely silent. Even in the quietest hours, life continued in small and gentle ways. Dogs wandered between houses searching for scraps left behind after the evening meal. Donkeys shifted in their pens. Somewhere in the distance, water touched the riverbank with a steady rhythm. The world rested, but it never completely stopped. Inside the builder's home, everyone had fallen asleep except for his wife. She sat alone for a little while beside the fading lamp, mending a tear in a linen garment. Her fingers moved carefully in the dim light. The room smelled faintly of bread, smoke, and warm clay. The children slept close together on woven mats, their breathing slow and peaceful after a long day. This small task, finished at the end of a tiring evening, was one of countless invisible duties that filled the lives of Egyptian women. Much of their work happened quietly, behind walls that history rarely remembers. Meals had to be prepared. Water had to be carried. Clothes needed repair. Grain had to be stored safely against insects and moisture. She placed the garment beside a basket and finally lay down to rest. Outside, the moon climbed higher. The village drifted into deeper sleep. Yet before many hours had passed, the cycle would begin again. Long before sunrise, while darkness still covered the fields, movement returned to the settlement. A few figures crossed the narrow streets carrying jars toward the river. Others stepped quietly into courtyards to begin preparing food. The stars had not yet disappeared, but the day had already started. Ancient Egypt often appears timeless in the imagination, as though life remained unchanged for centuries. In some ways, this was true. The same river flooded each year. The same crops filled the fields. Families passed down the same tools and traditions generation after generation. But within those familiar patterns, every household lived its own story. A fisherman worried about damaged nets. A mother worried about a sick child. A young apprentice worried about disappointing his teacher. Life unfolded through these ordinary concerns. Near the riverbank, one fisherman had arrived before dawn. He crouched beside his boat, examining the woven ropes that secured his nets. The work required patience. Small tears could become larger ones if left alone. He ran rough fingers across the fibers, repairing them in the cool darkness. His oldest son sat nearby, still fighting sleep. The boy had recently begun joining his father on these early mornings. He was old enough now to row, to untangle nets, and to learn the countless details that could not be written down. Fishing was knowledge carried in memory and passed from parent to child. The father spoke quietly as he worked. He explained how to watch the water. He pointed toward certain birds gathering along the reeds. He described how the wind changed before storms. The boy listened carefully. One day, this river would belong to him as much as it belonged to his father. As the first gray light appeared in the east, other boats emerged from the darkness. Their shapes drifted silently across the Nile, carried by oars and the gentle current. Some fishermen stood at the edges of their boats, scanning the water. Others worked without speaking, their movements shaped by years of habit. The Nile was generous, but it demanded effort. Fish provided food for villages and cities alike. Markets depended upon the daily catch. Families depended upon it as well. A poor morning on the river could leave people worried for days. Back in the settlement, smoke began to rise from cooking fires. Women knelt beside grinding stones, pushing heavy blocks back and forth across grain. The sound echoed from courtyard to courtyard, a familiar rhythm that belonged to every sunrise. Bread remained at the center of daily life. The work of preparing food consumed many hours. Grain had to be cleaned. Flour had to be made. Dough had to be mixed and shaped. Ovens had to be heated. Even after centuries, the process changed very little. A young girl helped her mother carry water from a nearby well. The clay jar felt heavy against her arms, and she walked carefully along the uneven road. Around her, neighbors were beginning their own morning routines. Some swept dust from their doorways. Others fed animals. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes and sat quietly while breakfast was prepared. The village was fully awake now. The builder stepped outside his home and looked toward the eastern horizon. The sun had not yet risen, but its arrival could already be felt. A warm breeze crossed the settlement. Palm trees swayed gently in the growing light. He stretched his aching shoulders. The years had changed him slowly. When he was younger, he could work from dawn until night with little complaint. Now, age had begun to settle into his bones. His hands remained strong, but each season seemed to leave him slightly more tired than the one before. He thought briefly about the day ahead. Stone to move. Tools to repair. Hours beneath the sun. Then, like countless mornings before, he joined the road leading toward the quarry. The journey had become part of his body. He knew every bend in the path, every patch of shade, every distant landmark rising from the desert. Beside him walked friends and neighbors who carried the same quiet exhaustion. They spoke softly. One man described a roof damaged by wind. Another mentioned that his youngest daughter had developed a fever. A third laughed gently while remembering a story from his childhood. These conversations were simple, yet they formed the fabric of daily life. As they approached the quarry, the first sunlight spilled across the land. The desert transformed in moments. Cold gray stone turned golden. Long shadows stretched across the sand. Birds circled high above the cliffs. Soon the sound of labor filled the air. Copper tools struck rock. Wooden sledges scraped across the ground. Foremen called instructions to workers. Dust rose beneath countless footsteps. The quarry was a world of movement. Teams of laborers worked together with careful coordination. Some cut stone from the cliffs. Others shaped blocks with hammers and chisels. Strong men pulled sledges across prepared paths while water was poured onto the sand to make the journey easier. The work was slow. Nothing happened quickly. Every block required hours of effort. Every mistake carried consequences. The builder joined his group and began lifting stones into place. Sweat soon covered his face. Dust settled into his hair and clothing. The sun climbed steadily overhead. Nearby, the young scribe sat beneath his shelter. He unrolled fresh sheets of papyrus and prepared his ink. Workers came and went before him throughout the morning. Supplies were counted. Deliveries were recorded. Rations were distributed. He wrote carefully. Education had given him opportunities unavailable to many laborers, but his path had not been easy. As a child, he had spent years memorizing symbols and practicing difficult writing exercises. His teachers had demanded perfection. Hours passed while he copied the same lines again and again. Mistakes earned harsh criticism. Yet his family had hoped that literacy would spare him from the hardest physical labor. Now, seated in the shade, he often watched the quarry with complicated feelings. The workers envied his clean hands. Sometimes he envied the simplicity of their tasks. Everyone carried burdens of one kind or another. As the morning wore on, the heat became more difficult to ignore. Egyptian summers could feel endless. The sunlight reflected from stone and sand until the entire landscape shimmered. Workers wrapped linen around their heads and necks, but the heat found them anyway. Water jars became more precious with each passing hour. At midday, labor slowed. Groups gathered beneath shelters and narrow strips of shade. Bread and onions emerged from cloth bundles. Some workers ate in silence, too tired for conversation. The builder sat beside an older man whose hair had begun to turn gray. The two had worked together for many years. The older man spoke quietly about his sons, who would soon begin working at the quarry themselves. He wondered whether they would find the same strength he once possessed. He wondered how long his own body would continue to endure the labor. The builder listened. He understood those worries. In ancient Egypt, age arrived early for many people. Years of carrying heavy loads, working beneath the sun, and surviving periods of hunger left deep marks upon the body. Pain became familiar. People accepted it as part of life. There were no quiet retirements waiting at the end of labor. Most people worked as long as they could. Beyond the quarry, life followed its own steady rhythm. Farmers moved through the fields beside the Nile. Their feet sank into soft earth while birds searched for insects among the crops. Irrigation channels carried water across the land, transforming dry soil into fertile farmland. A farmer paused to wipe sweat from his face. Beside him, his wife sorted bundles of harvested grain. Their children gathered fallen stalks nearby, laughing occasionally before returning to their work. The family had spent years shaping this small piece of land. Each season brought fresh uncertainty. Too much water could destroy crops. Too little water could do the same. Everything depended upon the Nile. The river itself remained calm that afternoon. Boats drifted across its surface beneath bright sails. Merchants traveled between settlements carrying pottery, cloth, wood, and food. Travelers rested in the shade of palm trees along the shore. One merchant leaned against his cargo and watched the water. He had spent much of his life moving between villages. He knew the changing colors of the river in every season. He recognized distant landmarks long before others could see them. Travel offered him glimpses of places unknown to most Egyptians. He had visited crowded cities filled with temples and workshops. He had slept beneath open skies far from home. He had crossed stretches of desert where only silence remained. Yet despite his journeys, he always found comfort in familiar things. Fresh bread. Cool water. The sound of voices at dusk. Home. As afternoon faded, the markets began to fill. Shoppers moved between stalls shaded by woven coverings. Potters arranged jars in careful rows. Bakers displayed warm loaves of bread. Fishermen laid out their catch on wooden tables. The market was one of the few places where many different lives crossed paths. Builders stood beside scribes. Farmers bargained with merchants. Children wandered between adults carrying baskets. The air smelled of dust, fish, oil, and smoke. An old woman inspected onions with practiced eyes. A young mother carried her sleeping child. Two men argued quietly over the price of cloth. The market was noisy, but its noise was ordinary and comforting. Life flowed through it every day. As evening approached, workers began returning home. The road from the quarry filled with tired footsteps. Faces were coated with dust. Muscles ached from hours of labor. Still, there was relief in knowing that the hardest part of the day had ended. The builder walked slowly. The sun hung low above the western desert, bathing the land in warm light. Shadows stretched across the road. Birds crossed the sky in dark shapes. He could already smell cooking fires from the settlement ahead. Children waited near the entrance to the village, watching for familiar faces. One little boy spotted his father and ran toward him. The builder smiled despite his exhaustion. Such moments mattered. They softened the weight of labor. Inside the home, preparations for the evening meal had been underway for hours. Bread cooled on woven trays. Vegetables simmered in clay pots. Water jars stood ready in the courtyard. The family gathered together. They ate slowly. Conversation moved gently from one subject to another. The children spoke of games played beneath the palm trees. Their mother described news from the market. The builder listened while rubbing tired hands. Night gradually settled over the village once more. The heat lifted. A cool wind arrived from the river. Neighbors climbed onto their rooftops to escape the warmth trapped inside their homes. Families sat beneath the stars and shared the final moments of the day. An elderly man pointed toward familiar constellations. Children listened to stories they had heard many times before. Someone played a simple tune on a reed instrument. Far away, beyond the fields and villages, the desert stretched into darkness. And above everything, the homes, the workshops, the boats, the sleeping animals, the stars watched silently over the ordinary people whose lives shaped the true story of Egypt. The stars remained above the valley for a little while longer, hanging over the river like distant lanterns. On the rooftops of the settlement, families slowly disappeared back into their homes as the night air cooled. Lamps burned lower behind mud-brick walls, and the voices that had drifted through the darkness became softer with each passing hour. For a brief time, Egypt belonged to silence. The fishermen had secured their boats along the shore. The merchants had covered their goods with cloth. The builders had stretched their tired bodies across woven mats. Even the animals resting in small pens beside the houses seemed to settle into deeper sleep. Only the Nile continued without pause. The river moved steadily through the darkness, slipping past fields and villages exactly as it had done for countless generations. Long before the first kings ruled from distant palaces, the water had already been carving its path through the land. Long after the people sleeping beside it had disappeared from memory, it would continue its quiet journey toward the sea. Inside the builder's home, the room had grown cool. The day's heat still lingered in the walls, but the thick mud brick held back the worst of it. The family slept close together. The youngest child had rolled onto his side, clutching a folded piece of linen beneath his head. The builder himself slept heavily. His dreams were simple and scattered. He dreamed of carrying stone beneath the bright sky. He dreamed of the riverbank where he had played as a boy. He dreamed of his father, whose face had become less clear with the passing years. Many people in ancient Egypt lived close to those who had come before them. Grandparents often remained within the household. Stories traveled from old voices to young ears. Children learned the shape of family history not from written records but from evenings spent listening beside lamps and cooking fires. The builder's father had also worked with stone. As a child, he had watched the old man return home covered in dust, his sandals worn thin from years of labor. Back then, the builder had believed his father would always remain strong. He had never imagined the slow changes that time would bring. Now, his own hair showed traces of gray. His own son had begun asking questions about work. The years moved quietly in Egypt. No one woke one morning and suddenly felt old. Instead, age arrived through countless small moments. A back that remained sore for longer than before. Hands that stiffened in the morning air. Eyes that struggled to see in fading light. Outside, somewhere beyond the sleeping houses, an old watchman sat awake. He leaned against a wall and wrapped his linen cloak more tightly around his shoulders. His work was not difficult, but it required patience. Through the night, he walked slowly along the edge of the settlement, listening for unusual sounds. He knew every corner of the village. He recognized the shape of each roof against the stars. He could identify families simply by hearing their footsteps on the stone paths. During the day, few people noticed him. Yet at night, when the rest of the settlement slept, his quiet presence became part of the rhythm of life. The hours passed. Little by little, the eastern sky began to pale. Morning approached once more. The first to rise were often the bakers. In one corner of the settlement, a woman pushed open her wooden door and stepped into the cool darkness. She carried a small lamp in one hand and a basket in the other. Around her, the world remained silent except for the distant sound of water against the shore. She knelt beside the grinding stone. The work had become part of her body long ago. Even half asleep, her hands knew exactly how to move. Grain fell onto the stone surface. The heavy upper stone rolled back and forth. The sound was low and steady. Stone against stone. Again. And again. Within a short time, the noise began to spread through the village as other households woke. One family lit a cooking fire. Another opened a storage jar. Someone carried water from a nearby well. The day was beginning. As dawn slowly unfolded, Egypt revealed itself piece by piece. The sky turned from black to deep blue. The outlines of palm trees emerged along the riverbank. Birds stirred among the reeds. Thin smoke rose above the rooftops. The builder awoke to the smell of bread baking. He sat up carefully, trying not to disturb the children still sleeping beside him. His muscles felt heavy from the previous day's labor. For a moment, he remained seated in silence, listening to the familiar sounds beyond the walls. The grinding stones. The footsteps. The quiet conversations. Nothing had changed. And yet, every morning carried something new, a different wind, a different light, a different worry waiting somewhere in the hours ahead. He stepped into the courtyard. The coolness of dawn touched his skin, but he knew it would not last. By midday, the sun would once again transform the village into a place of heat and dust. His wife handed him a piece of fresh bread. It was still warm from the oven. The bread itself was simple. Made from grain grown beside the Nile and ground by hand, it formed the center of nearly every meal. Rich families enjoyed finer foods, but ordinary workers depended on bread more than anything else. Alongside it came onions, dates when available, and beer made from fermented grain. The beer was not like the drinks that would exist thousands of years later. It was thick and nourishing, consumed by adults and children alike. It provided energy for long days of labor beneath the sun. The builder ate slowly. Nearby, his son tied the straps of his sandals. The boy had begun accompanying older workers on small tasks around the quarry. Though still young, he was learning the rhythm of adult life. He watched carefully when tools were repaired. He listened when men discussed the movement of stone blocks. He tried to imitate the confident steps of those who had worked for many years. His father noticed all of this without speaking. There was comfort in seeing the boy grow stronger, but there was also sadness. He knew what awaited him. Long days. Tired muscles. A lifetime measured by seasons and harvests. Yet such thoughts remained quiet and unspoken. Outside, the road toward the river had already become busy. Women balanced clay jars on their heads as they walked in groups toward the water. Their conversations drifted through the morning air. They spoke about children and neighbors. They discussed prices at the market. They shared news of illnesses and marriages. The river served many purposes beyond farming and travel. It was also the center of daily life. People bathed there, washed clothing there, and gathered water there. Friendships formed beside its banks. The women reached the shore just as the sun appeared above the horizon. Golden light spread across the water. Boats rocked gently in place. Fishermen prepared their nets. The Nile seemed calm and endless. One young mother paused before filling her jar. Her child sat nearby in the sand, drawing shapes with a stick. For a moment, she simply watched the sunlight dance across the river. Moments like these existed quietly within ancient life. Not grand moments. Not moments that scribes would record. Only small pauses between duties, when ordinary people stood still and looked at the world around them. Farther down the riverbank, fishermen were beginning another day. An older fisherman worked beside his grandson. Together, they untangled a net damaged by reeds. The old man's hands moved slowly now. Years on the river had bent his back and stiffened his fingers. He spoke little. Most of his lessons came through action. The boy watched as knots were tied. He watched how the boat was balanced. He watched how his grandfather studied the movement of birds above the water. Knowledge passed silently from one generation to another. As the village grew brighter, the builders made their way toward the quarry. Dust rose beneath their sandals. The road stretched ahead through open ground where the heat would soon gather. Small groups formed naturally along the path. Some men walked quickly. Others moved at a slower pace. The older workers often stayed together, conserving their energy. The builder joined two friends he had known since childhood. The three men had spent years working side by side. They had celebrated births together. They had mourned losses together. They had watched one another grow older beneath the same unchanging sky. One of them had recently lost his mother. Another worried about his daughter, who had fallen ill. The builder listened as they spoke. Life in ancient Egypt could be difficult, but people rarely carried their burdens alone. Families, neighbors, and fellow workers formed close communities. Everyone depended on someone else. At the quarry, labor began almost immediately. The sounds of tools echoed between the stone walls. Men hauled ropes into position. Foremen inspected the day's assignments. Nearby, scribes prepared fresh ink and checked lists from previous days. The young scribe sat beneath his shelter, arranging his writing tools in neat rows. Though his work was different from that of the laborers, his routine remained just as predictable. He dipped his reed pen into black ink and began recording deliveries. A shipment of grain had arrived. Several workers had been reassigned. One tool had broken and needed replacement. The details filled his day. Sometimes, while writing, he looked toward the quarry and wondered what life would have been like if he had never learned to read. His own father had been a craftsman. His brothers worked with wood. Only he had followed the path of the scribe. Education brought respect, but it also created distance. He belonged neither fully to the world of laborers nor to the world of officials. He existed somewhere between them. The sun climbed higher. The heat returned. Workers wiped sweat from their faces and continued their tasks. Stone dust coated the air. Voices rose and faded. Hours passed. At midday, the quarry grew quieter. Men gathered beneath scraps of shade to eat. The builder sat against a wall, stretching his tired legs. Beside him, younger workers spoke about the future. One hoped to marry soon. Another dreamed of owning a larger home. The older men listened with gentle amusement. They remembered having the same hopes years earlier. Life had taught them patience. They knew that dreams often changed shape over time. The meal was modest. Bread. Onions. A few dates. Water passed from hand to hand. No one hurried. For a little while, labor paused. Far away, in the markets along the Nile, a different kind of work continued. Potters shaped wet clay beneath shaded roofs. Their hands moved carefully, turning simple earth into bowls, jars, and storage vessels. The spinning wheel hummed softly as fingers pressed against damp surfaces. Nearby, weavers sat before wooden frames, pulling thread through thread with practiced movements. Children carried baskets between workshops. Merchants arranged goods beneath cloth coverings. The market lived through motion. Every object passed through many hands before reaching its final owner. A clay jar might begin as mud beside the river. A potter would shape it. A merchant would transport it. A family would fill it with water or grain. Years later, the jar might crack and return once more to the earth. Nothing remained unchanged forever. As afternoon stretched across the valley, the heat settled heavily over the land. Even the animals sought shelter. Dogs slept beneath carts. Donkeys stood motionless in narrow shadows. Birds hid among palm branches. The world itself seemed to slow. And through it all, the Nile continued to flow quietly past villages and fields, carrying with it the lives of countless ordinary people whose days were shaped not by glory or conquest, but by bread ovens, dusty roads, tired hands, and the simple comfort of returning home at sunset. By late afternoon, the light over the valley had begun to soften. The fierce brightness of midday slowly faded into warmer colors that spread across the river and the fields beside it. Long shadows stretched from palm trees and mud-brick walls, reaching across narrow roads worn smooth by generations of footsteps. At the quarry, the day's work continued, though more slowly now. The workers had been under the sun since dawn. Their shoulders ached. Their hands stung from rough stone and heavy ropes. Dust clung to their skin and settled into the folds of their linen clothing. The builder paused for a moment and looked toward the west. He could already see the sky beginning to change. For him, the approach of evening always brought a quiet sense of relief. It did not erase the exhaustion in his muscles or the pain in his back, but it promised rest, food, and the familiar sounds of home. Around him, the quarry was still full of movement. A team of younger laborers pulled a wooden sledge across packed earth. Men carrying tools walked toward storage sheds. Foremen checked the work completed during the day. Nearby, the young scribe carefully rolled up several sheets of papyrus, brushing away fine dust before placing them into a leather case. The scribe stretched his cramped fingers. Many people believed that writing was an easier life, but long hours bent over records brought their own kind of fatigue. His eyes often burned after a day spent studying symbols and numbers. Sometimes, after sunset, he would close them and still see lines of ink floating in the darkness. He gathered his belongings and prepared for the journey home. Like the laborers, he followed the same road every evening. The same stone paths. The same distant view of the river. The same smoke rising from cooking fires in the settlement. For ordinary Egyptians, routine shaped nearly every part of life. Days did not change quickly. Entire years passed with little difference between one season and the next. Yet within that steady rhythm, people found comfort. They knew where the morning sun would fall in the courtyard. They knew which neighbor woke first. They knew the smell of fresh bread drifting through the streets. These small certainties made life feel stable in a world that could often be difficult. The workers began leaving the quarry in small groups. The builder walked beside an older man whose knees had started troubling him. The old laborer moved carefully over the uneven ground, leaning slightly on a wooden staff he had carved himself. The two men had known each other for many years. When they were younger, they had competed to see who could carry heavier loads. They had laughed together during midday meals and shared stories beneath the stars after long days of work. Now their conversations had changed. They spoke more often about their children. They talked about sore joints and fading strength. The older man mentioned that his eldest son would soon marry. Preparations had already begun. Family members were helping to repair the small house where the young couple would live. The builder listened quietly. Marriage in ancient Egypt was not surrounded by great ceremonies for most ordinary people. Life simply continued in a new shape. A son or daughter left one household and joined another. New routines formed. New responsibilities appeared. Children arrived. Years passed. The cycle began again. As they walked, the road became busier. Farmers returned from the fields carrying tools over their shoulders. Fishermen balanced baskets filled with their catch. Women carrying water jars stepped carefully around goats and donkeys wandering near the village entrance. The sounds of evening slowly filled the air. Voices drifted from open courtyards. Children laughed as they chased one another between houses. Wood crackled in cooking fires. A dog barked somewhere beyond the market. The builder could smell bread before he reached home. His wife had spent much of the afternoon preparing the evening meal. The work had begun hours earlier. She had swept the courtyard, repaired a torn piece of linen, checked the grain stores, and carried water from the river. Now she knelt beside the oven, brushing flour from her hands. Inside the house, the children had gathered near the doorway, waiting for their father to return. Their days were very different from his, though they were already learning the habits of adulthood. The older boy had spent the afternoon helping a neighbor repair a fence. The younger children had collected reeds and carried small baskets for their mother. Even play often resembled work. Children imitated the world around them. They copied the movements of fishermen, builders, and merchants. They learned not through formal lessons but through watching and participating. The builder stepped into the courtyard and set down his tools. His youngest daughter ran toward him. He lifted her into his arms for a brief moment before sitting on a low stool beside the wall. The evening breeze had begun to arrive from the river. It carried the smell of wet earth and distant water. For a little while, no one spoke. The family simply rested together. As the sky darkened, lamps were lit inside nearby homes. Their small flames flickered against mud-brick walls, casting long shadows across rooms that held only a few possessions. Most families owned very little. A handful of clay jars. Woven baskets. Simple furniture. A few tools. Perhaps a necklace passed down through generations. Yet these objects carried meaning because they belonged to daily life. A cracked bowl might have served the same family for many years. A wooden stool could have been built by a grandfather long ago. Nothing was easily replaced. People repaired what they owned again and again. In another part of the settlement, an elderly woman sat outside her home while the last sunlight touched the rooftops. Her hair had turned completely white many years earlier. Deep lines marked her face. Children often gathered around her in the evenings. She remembered stories that no one else still knew. Tonight, as several grandchildren sat nearby, she spoke softly about the flood seasons of her youth. She remembered years when the Nile had risen high enough to swallow entire fields. She remembered carrying baskets of grain beside her mother. She remembered a summer of terrible heat when many people became ill. The children listened closely. To them, her stories felt ancient. To her, they felt like yesterday. Memory moved differently with age. The old woman paused and looked toward the river. Many of the people she had known as a child were gone now. Friends, brothers, neighbors all carried away by time. New families lived in houses that once belonged to others. Still, the settlement itself remained familiar. The same roads crossed between the homes. The same wind moved through the palm trees. The same stars would soon appear overhead. As darkness settled fully across the valley, life slowed. Merchants closed their stalls in the market. Potters covered unfinished work with cloth. Fishermen secured their boats to wooden posts along the shore. The Nile reflected the fading light of the sky. Its surface glowed softly beneath the first stars. A small boat drifted near the riverbank where a fisherman sat alone, repairing his net. He worked without hurry. The day was over, and tomorrow's tasks could wait until morning. Nearby, several boys skipped stones across the water. Their laughter echoed briefly and then disappeared into the evening. Such moments were rarely recorded by scribes. No monument was built to honor them. No official document preserved them. Yet these simple scenes formed the true heart of ancient life. The greatness of Egypt rested not only on stone temples and distant rulers, but on ordinary evenings beside the river. Back at the builder's home, the family had gathered for their meal. Bread lay in the center of the room. There were onions and beans, along with a small piece of dried fish saved from the market. Clay cups filled with beer stood beside woven mats. The meal was modest, but it was enough. The builder listened while his children talked about their day. His wife described a conversation she had shared with neighbors near the river. Someone mentioned an upcoming festival in a nearby town. Outside, voices drifted through the night. Families all across the settlement were doing the same thing: eating, talking, resting. After the meal, the older boy carried water into the courtyard while his mother cleaned the bowls. The younger children grew sleepy. One by one, they leaned against the wall or curled up on the mats. The builder stepped onto the flat roof of the house. The night air felt cool against his face. Above him, the stars had returned. Without lamps or firelight to hide them, the sky seemed endless. Thousands of bright points stretched across the darkness from east to west. The people of Egypt knew these stars well. Travelers used them to find their way. Priests watched them carefully. Farmers looked upward and wondered what the coming seasons would bring. For ordinary workers, however, the stars often meant something simpler. They marked the end of another day. The builder sat alone for a while. In the distance, he could hear the faint sounds of the river. Somewhere nearby, a mother sang softly to a child. A donkey shifted in its sleep. The village rested beneath the sky. He thought about tomorrow. There would be more stone to move. More dust. More heat. The same road to the quarry. The same evening journey home. Yet he did not think of these things with sadness. Routine had become part of him. The rhythm of labor, meals, family, and sleep gave shape to his life. Like the Nile itself, it flowed steadily forward, carrying him through the years. Below him, lamps were slowly being extinguished one by one. Darkness spread across the settlement. The markets fell silent. The ovens cooled. The roads emptied. And under the vast sky of ancient Egypt, countless ordinary people closed their eyes, resting their tired bodies while the river continued its endless journey through the night. The night beside the Nile remained peaceful, but the darkness never lasted forever. Slowly, quietly, the world began preparing for another morning. The first changes were almost impossible to notice. A slight movement of air through the palm leaves. A distant sound from the riverbank. The faintest color appearing beyond the eastern horizon. Ancient Egypt lived by these small changes. People watched the sky. They listened to the river. They noticed the behavior of animals and the condition of the fields. The natural world was not separate from daily life. It was part of every decision, every meal, and every journey. Before sunrise, a farmer stepped outside his home carrying a wooden tool over his shoulder. His family still slept inside. The air was cool, and the ground felt damp beneath his sandals. He walked toward the fields alone. For a few moments, there was only the sound of his footsteps. He had done this walk thousands of times. The path between his home and the farmland was familiar enough that he could follow it even before daylight arrived. Along the way, he passed storage buildings, animal pens, and small gardens where herbs and vegetables grew. When he reached the field, he stopped beside the irrigation channel. The water moved slowly. He watched carefully. A farmer's life depended on attention. A small problem with the channel could affect an entire harvest. A broken tool could delay important work. A few days of neglect could create difficulties that lasted for months. There was little room for carelessness. He crouched beside the water and adjusted the flow with his hands. The mud was cold against his fingers. Soon, the first birds began calling from the reeds. The morning had arrived. Across the valley, thousands of people were beginning similar routines. The fishermen prepared their boats. The bakers heated their ovens. The builders gathered their tools. The merchants opened their stalls. The scribes organized their records. Egypt was a land of many different occupations, but all of them were connected. The farmer grew the grain. The baker turned it into bread. The worker carried supplies. The merchant moved goods between communities. Every person depended on the work of many others. The builder's household also awakened. His wife began preparing breakfast while the children slowly rose from their sleeping mats. The youngest child still looked tired, rubbing his eyes as he followed his older brother outside. The morning air was already warming. The family ate together before separating for the day's tasks. The builder noticed his son watching him carefully. The boy wanted to become like the men he saw every day, the workers who carried stone, shaped tools, and walked confidently through the settlement. The builder understood this feeling. When he had been young, he had watched his own father in the same way. Children often imagined adulthood as something distant and powerful. They saw only the visible parts, the strength, the skill, the respect. They did not yet understand the tired evenings or the pain that came with years of labor. The builder placed a hand on his son's shoulder. He said little. In Egypt, many lessons were not spoken. They were shown. The boy would learn by watching, by helping, by making mistakes, by slowly becoming part of the world around him. The road toward the quarry filled once again. But today, the builder noticed something different. A group of younger workers had joined the path. Their voices were louder. Their steps were faster. They carried themselves with the energy of people who had not yet spent decades beneath the sun. The older workers watched them quietly. They remembered being young. They remembered believing their strength would never fade. The journey continued. Dust rose behind their feet. The desert stretched around them. The morning sun climbed higher. When they reached the quarry, the daily rhythm began. Tools were distributed. Assignments were given. Stone was examined. The work moved forward. The builders of ancient Egypt were not simply lifting rocks. They were part of a carefully organized world where thousands of small actions had to happen in order. Some workers shaped stone. Some transported materials. Some prepared food. Some repaired equipment. Some kept records. A massive project depended on ordinary people performing ordinary tasks again and again. The builder worked beside a man who specialized in smoothing stone surfaces. His hands moved with great patience, removing rough edges and creating cleaner shapes. The craftsman had spent years learning this skill. When he was younger, he had made many mistakes. Some stones had cracked under his tools. Some pieces had been rejected because the shape was not correct. But over time, his movements became natural. His hands seemed to know what to do before his mind even decided. This was true for many craftsmen in ancient Egypt. Potters, carpenters, weavers, metal workers, and builders all developed knowledge through repetition. The world rewarded patience. A person who practiced the same skill for many years could create things of remarkable quality. Yet behind every skilled worker was a long history of ordinary days. Days of practice. Days of failure. Days of trying again. The sun continued rising. Near the edge of the quarry, a group of workers prepared a meal. Food was one of the most important parts of daily labor. Without enough nourishment, workers could not continue through long hours of physical effort. Large amounts of grain were stored and distributed to workers. Bread and beer provided energy. Vegetables, dates, and fish added variety when available. Meals were simple, but they were carefully connected to the rhythm of work. Eating was not only about hunger. It was also a moment of rest. A moment when people sat together. A moment when friendships grew. During these pauses, workers shared stories from their homes. One man described his daughter's first steps. Another talked about a new roof being built over his courtyard. Someone else remembered a festival from many years before. The conversations were ordinary. But ordinary conversations reveal the true texture of life. They show what people cared about, what they feared, what they hoped for. The same was true in the homes of ancient Egypt. While workers spent their days outside, families created another world within the household. The home was a place of preparation and recovery. Mudbrick walls protected people from heat. Small windows allowed air to pass through. Roofs provided sleeping spaces during the hottest nights. Courtyards became places for cooking, weaving, repairing tools, and gathering together. A home did not need to be large to feel meaningful. For most people, comfort came from familiarity. A favorite place to sit. A familiar cooking fire. A child sleeping nearby. The sound of family voices. In another village along the Nile, a young woman sat weaving linen beneath a shaded roof. She worked slowly. The threads had to be handled carefully. A mistake could ruin hours of effort. Her mother had taught her this skill when she was still a child. Now she taught her younger sister. The younger girl watched the movement of the shuttle passing between the threads. She was learning something that had been part of her family's life for generations. The linen created through their work would become clothing, bedding, and trade goods. The process connected many people. Farmers grew the flax. Workers prepared the fibers. Weavers transformed them into cloth. Merchants carried the finished products. A single piece of linen represented the work of many hands. As afternoon approached, the heat grew stronger. The young woman paused and wiped her forehead. Even under shade, the air felt heavy. The Egyptian climate shaped every activity. Work began early whenever possible. People avoided unnecessary movement during the hottest hours. Animals rested. Children stayed close to shaded areas. The rhythm of life followed the sun. Morning was for activity. Midday was for endurance. Evening was for recovery. This pattern continued across generations. At the river, fishermen pulled their boats back onto the shore. Their workday had ended. Some had returned with a good catch. Others had found less success. A fisherman could never fully predict what the river would provide. He cleaned his nets carefully before storing them. The same tools would be used again tomorrow. Repairing and maintaining possessions was an important part of life. Objects were valuable because they required time and effort to create. A broken basket was repaired. A torn garment was patched. A damaged tool was fixed. People lived surrounded by things that carried history. A wooden bowl might hold memories of countless meals. A fishing net might have been repaired by several generations. A house wall might contain the hands of parents and grandparents who helped build it. Ancient homes were not just structures. They were places where time collected. As the evening approached, the builder returned home once again. The road felt familiar beneath his feet. The sun lowered behind the desert. The fields glowed softly. The river reflected the changing sky. He passed farmers finishing their work and children playing near the homes. A group of merchants had arrived late in the day, and their animals rested beside the market. The settlement was entering its quieter hours. At home, his wife had prepared the evening meal. The children were already waiting. They gathered together as the last light disappeared. The meal was simple. The conversation was gentle. Outside, the world cooled. The builder looked around the small room. The walls were plain. The furniture was modest. The possessions were few. But this was his world. This was the place where he rested. Where his children grew. Where stories were shared. Where each day ended. Later, when everyone had settled down, the builder stepped outside one last time. The river breeze moved through the village. Above him, the stars returned. He listened. The distant sound of water. The quiet movement of animals. The soft voices of neighbors. The ancient world was often remembered through its largest creations. But beneath those creations were countless evenings like this one. Evenings filled with tired workers, warm bread, simple homes, and families resting beneath the same sky. The night grew deeper. The lamps burned lower. And beside the endless Nile, another ordinary day of Egyptian life slowly disappeared into sleep. The quiet night beside the Nile continued, carrying the sounds of a sleeping village into the darkness. The last lamps inside the homes burned gently, their small flames moving with the evening breeze that entered through open doorways and narrow windows. Beyond the houses, the fields rested beneath the stars. The crops that had grown beside the river stood still. The boats along the shore remained tied to their wooden posts. The desert beyond the green valley waited silently beneath the moon. Ancient Egypt was a land of contrasts. A narrow strip of fertile land followed the river, surrounded by wide stretches of dry desert. Life gathered close to the water because the river offered everything people needed to survive. Water. Food. Transportation. A place to build homes. A reason to remain. For many Egyptians, the Nile was not something they simply lived near. It was the center of their existence. Their days followed its movements. Their meals depended upon it. Their work was shaped by its seasons. Their memories were connected to its banks. A child born beside the river would grow up knowing the sound of its current. A farmer would measure time by the rising and falling waters. A fisherman would understand its moods better than any written record could explain. The river was always present. Even in sleep. Before dawn returned, a fisherman woke inside his small home near the shore. His body felt heavy from yesterday's work, but there was no time to remain in bed. His family depended on the river. The baskets of fish he brought home would help provide food and goods for trade. He stepped outside quietly. The air was cold. The ground beneath his feet was still damp from the night. He looked toward the water and saw a faint mist floating above the surface. For a moment, he simply stood there. The early morning beside the Nile had a peaceful beauty that belonged only to those who knew it well. The river reflected the fading stars. The palm trees stood dark against the sky. Birds rested among the reeds, waiting for sunlight. He walked toward his boat. Every rope, every knot, every wooden piece. He knew them all. His boat was not perfect. The wood showed signs of years of use. Repairs had been made many times. But it was dependable. Like many possessions in ancient Egypt, it carried a history. It carried his work. It carried his family's survival. He pushed away from the shore. The water accepted the boat quietly. As he moved into the river, the village behind him slowly awakened. Elsewhere, farmers were beginning their morning tasks. The flood cycle of the Nile shaped much of Egyptian agriculture. When the waters rose, they left behind rich soil that allowed crops to grow. When the waters receded, farmers worked the land carefully, planting and caring for fields that supported entire communities. Farming was a patient relationship with nature. A farmer could prepare the soil perfectly and still face uncertainty. The weather could change. Animals could damage crops. Illness could prevent someone from working. Yet every year, people returned to the fields. They planted again. They waited again. They hoped again. In one small farming village, a father walked beside his teenage daughter through the fields. She carried a small basket. He pointed out areas where the plants needed attention. She listened carefully. Like many young people in Egypt, she was learning the knowledge that kept her family alive. She learned which plants grew best. She learned how to store grain. She learned how to recognize changes in the soil. Education did not always happen inside formal schools. Much of life was a classroom, a field, a workshop, a kitchen, a riverbank. The lessons were passed through daily actions. As the sun rose higher, the farmer's family returned home. The courtyard was already warm. His wife prepared food while his younger children helped carry supplies. The house was filled with familiar sounds. Clay bowls being moved. Wood being placed near the cooking fire. Voices speaking from room to room. A home in ancient Egypt was often a busy place. Even simple living required constant effort. Water had to be collected. Food had to be prepared. Clothing had to be maintained. Animals needed care. Tools required repair. The idea of a completely quiet and effortless life was unknown. Comfort came not from having little work. Comfort came from knowing the rhythm of the work. People knew what was expected of them. They knew the seasons. They knew their responsibilities. They knew the people around them. This familiarity created a kind of peace. Far away from the fields, inside a workshop near the city, another group of workers began their day. Craftsmen sat beside wooden tables surrounded by tools. One man carved furniture. Another shaped copper objects. A third polished stone containers until their surfaces became smooth. Craftsmanship required patience. The workers repeated the same motions thousands of times. Cut. Shape. Smooth. Check. Repeat. Their hands carried knowledge that could not easily be explained with words. A young apprentice watched his teacher carefully. He wanted to work faster. He wanted to create objects as beautiful as the older craftsman. But the older man reminded him through silence and example that good work required patience. Ancient Egyptian craftsmen understood that rushing created mistakes. The best results came from steady movements. A careful hand. A calm mind. Years of practice. The apprentice would learn this eventually. Everyone did. As the day continued, the cities and villages of Egypt filled with activity. Along crowded streets, merchants displayed goods beneath woven coverings. People moved between stalls carrying baskets and jars. The smell of fresh bread mixed with smoke from cooking fires. Animals passed through narrow pathways. Children followed parents through the busy markets. The market was not only a place of exchange. It was a place where people met. News traveled there. Friendships were renewed there. Arrangements were made there. A farmer might trade grain for tools. A fisherman might exchange fish for cloth. A craftsman might sell his work to a merchant traveling along the river. Money was not always the center of these exchanges. Relationships mattered. Trust mattered. Reputation mattered. A person known for honesty could build connections that lasted for many years. In the shade of one market stall, an elderly merchant counted jars of oil. His hands moved slowly. He had spent his entire life trading goods. When he was young, he traveled often. Now, he preferred remaining close to home. He watched younger merchants hurry through the market and remembered his own younger days. He remembered the excitement of distant journeys. The uncertainty of unfamiliar roads. The feeling of returning home after weeks away. Time had softened those memories. Now he found happiness in quieter things. A morning walk. A conversation with neighbors. A meal shared with family. The older he became, the more he appreciated simple moments. This feeling was common among many elderly people in Egypt. After a lifetime of work, they often found meaning in family and memory. They became keepers of stories. They carried the past into the present. They taught younger generations how life had been before. In the evening, families gathered around them. Children listened. Grandchildren asked questions. The old voices connected one generation to another. As the sun moved across the sky, the heat reached its strongest point. The streets became quieter. Many people rested when possible. Inside homes, curtains or woven coverings helped block the harsh sunlight. People sat in shaded areas. Some repaired tools. Some prepared food. Some simply rested their tired bodies. Rest was not laziness. Rest was necessary. A body that worked every day needed moments of stillness. A worker who ignored exhaustion risked injury and illness. Ancient people understood the limits of their bodies because they lived so closely with physical effort. They felt every season, every change, every burden. The builder, meanwhile, continued his work at the quarry. The days were becoming harder as the years passed. He sometimes found himself watching younger workers and remembering when he had moved with the same energy. But he also knew something they did not yet understand. Strength was not only found in the body. It was found in patience, in experience, in knowing how to continue even when the day felt long. His younger companions often asked him for advice. How should a tool be handled? How should stone be moved? How could mistakes be avoided? He answered calmly. He had learned through many years of watching and doing. The knowledge inside him was valuable. Not because it was written down. Because it had been lived. As evening arrived, the workers left the quarry. The journey home was slower than the journey there. The sun painted the desert in orange and gold. The workers walked through long shadows. Some carried tools. Others carried small bundles of supplies. Their conversations were quiet. The day was nearly finished. When the builder reached home, he found his family sitting outside. The children were watching the sky change colors. His wife had prepared the meal. A neighbor had stopped by to share news from the market. The courtyard felt warm. Not because of the fire. Because of familiar voices. The meal was eaten slowly. No one rushed. The evening belonged to family. Afterward, the builder sat beside his children and listened as they spoke about their dreams. One wanted to become a craftsman. Another wanted to travel along the river. The youngest simply wanted to follow his father everywhere. The builder smiled. He knew children imagine the future differently than adults. They saw possibility where adults saw responsibility. But perhaps that was part of what made childhood special. The ability to dream before understanding every difficulty. The night grew darker. The neighbor returned home. The children became sleepy. The village settled once more. The builder looked toward the river. The same water that had carried fishermen home had also carried merchants, farmers, and travelers for countless generations. It connected every part of Egyptian life. And as another quiet night descended over the valley, the people of Egypt rested in their simple homes, preparing for another morning of familiar work beneath the endless sky. The night passed slowly over the valley of the Nile. The homes became quiet one by one. The final lamps disappeared behind wooden doors. The sounds of conversation faded into the distance. Only the soft movement of the river remained, flowing through the darkness as it had done for thousands of years. Above the village, the stars watched silently. For the people sleeping below, tomorrow would bring another day of work, another day of responsibilities, another day shaped by the same natural rhythms that had guided their ancestors. The world of ancient Egypt was built around repetition. The same fields were planted. The same waters were crossed. The same tools were repaired. The same songs were heard beside cooking fires. To someone looking from the outside, this life might appear slow and unchanging. But for the people who lived it, these repeated moments created a deep sense of belonging. They knew their place in the world. They knew the land beneath their feet. They knew the river that gave them life. Before sunrise, a woman living near the edge of the settlement woke beside her sleeping children. Her home was smaller than some others nearby, but it carried the warmth of many years. The walls had been repaired several times. Small cracks had been filled with fresh mud. The wooden door had been replaced by her husband after a season of heavy winds. The house showed the marks of ordinary life. It was not perfect. But it was theirs. She stepped into the courtyard and looked toward the sky. The morning was still cool. She began preparing food while the rest of the household slowly awakened. The first task was always the same. Bread. Grain was one of the foundations of Egyptian life. It connected farmers, workers, bakers, and families across the land. From the fields beside the Nile to the ovens inside homes, countless hands were involved before a single piece of bread reached the table. The woman placed grain onto the grinding stone. The heavy stone moved beneath her hands. The sound filled the quiet morning. In another home nearby, someone else was doing the same. And another. And another. Across the villages of Egypt, the same movement repeated as the sun approached the horizon. Thousands of small homes beginning the day together. Not through grand announcements. Not through ceremonies. Through simple work. The woman's oldest daughter helped prepare the meal. She was becoming more familiar with household responsibilities. She knew how to organize supplies, how to prepare simple dishes, and how to care for younger children. Her mother watched her carefully. Teaching was often quiet. There were no long explanations. A child learned by standing beside someone experienced. By observing. By trying. By repeating. The knowledge of daily life passed gently from one generation to the next. Outside, the village began to awaken. A man led his animals toward the fields. A fisherman carried his equipment toward the river. A group of workers walked together along the dusty road. Smoke rose from cooking fires. The smell of bread drifted through the air. The sun appeared above the eastern horizon. Another day had begun. For farmers, the morning hours were precious. The temperature was cooler, and the land was easier to work before the strongest heat arrived. A farmer walked between rows of crops, examining the plants carefully. He carried a simple tool made from wood. His movements were slow and deliberate. Farming required attention. A farmer had to notice small changes. The color of leaves. The condition of soil. The movement of insects. The level of water in irrigation channels. The success of a harvest depended on thousands of small decisions. A field was not simply a place where plants grew. It was a relationship between people and nature. The farmer's hands touched the same soil his father had touched. His father had learned from his own father. The knowledge stretched backward through many generations. Along the riverbank, fishermen prepared for another journey. The boats moved quietly through the morning mist. One fisherman worked alone. He had spent decades on the Nile. He knew the river during every season. He knew how it looked after heavy floods. He knew how it felt during dry periods. He knew where the currents changed. To others, the river was water. To him, it was a living map. He guided his boat with confidence. The morning passed peacefully. A few birds flew low across the surface. The reeds moved gently in the breeze. The fisherman lowered his net and waited. Patience was part of his life. The river could not be rushed. Neither could many things in ancient Egypt. A stone could not be shaped instantly. A crop could not grow overnight. A skill could not be mastered in a single season. Life rewarded endurance. This understanding existed everywhere. In workshops. In fields. In homes. In families. At the quarry, the builders followed the same principle. The great stones surrounding them were shaped through countless careful actions. Workers did not create enormous structures in one moment. They moved slowly, step by step, day after day. A single worker might spend years performing the same type of task. To some, this might seem repetitive. But repetition created mastery. The builder knew every sound made by his tools. He knew when stone would respond differently. He knew when a surface required more attention. His experience had become part of his hands. A younger worker beside him watched closely. The young man often became impatient. He wanted to become skilled quickly. He wanted the confidence of older workers. The builder understood. He had once felt the same. He explained that patience was part of the work. The stone had its own nature. The worker had to learn how to cooperate with it. The young man listened. Perhaps he did not fully understand yet. But someday, after many years, he would. Near the quarry, workers received supplies brought from nearby settlements. Baskets of grain. Jars of water. Bundles of vegetables. Everything required organization. Behind the scenes, many people worked to support those performing physical labor. Carriers transported goods. Scribes recorded deliveries. Officials managed storage. Farmers produced food. Craftsmen created tools. The daily life of Egypt depended on countless connections. No single person could exist alone. The young scribe continued his work beneath a shaded area. His papyrus was filled with carefully written symbols. He recorded information that seemed ordinary at the time. Numbers of workers. Amounts of grain. Lists of materials. To him, these were daily responsibilities. He could not know that such records would later help people understand ancient Egyptian life. He was simply doing his job. The same was true for everyone. The fisherman repairing his net. The farmer checking his crops. The woman grinding grain. The worker shaping stone. None of them knew that their ordinary actions would become a window into the distant past. They were simply living. As the afternoon arrived, the settlement slowed. The heat covered the land. Walls became warm. The air seemed still. Inside homes, families rested where they could. Some people repaired clothing. Some prepared tools. Some slept briefly. A short rest during the hottest hours could restore energy for the evening. Children often found ways to entertain themselves even during quiet afternoons. They played with small handmade toys. They practiced skills they saw adults using. They created games from simple materials. A piece of wood. A clay figure. A small ball made from woven fibers. Entertainment did not require many possessions. Imagination filled the empty spaces. In the shade of one courtyard, several children played beside their grandmother. She watched them with a gentle smile. She remembered when she had been their age. The world had changed in many small ways. Different homes had been built. Different people had moved into the village. But children still laughed. They still became curious. They still asked questions about the world around them. Some things remained the same across generations. As evening approached, the village slowly returned to activity. The cooler air invited people outside. Farmers returned from fields. Workers came home from workshops. Fishermen carried their catch toward markets. The streets filled once again with movement. The builder walked home carrying the tiredness of another day. But he also carried something else. A quiet satisfaction. He had completed his work. He had provided for his family. He had lived another day within the rhythm that connected him to everyone around him. At home, his wife prepared the evening meal. The children gathered nearby. The house filled with familiar sounds. A clay bowl placed on the floor. Bread being broken. Voices sharing stories. Outside, the first stars appeared. The builder listened to his family. He thought about how much of life was made from small moments. Not the largest achievements. Not the things carved into stone. But the daily experiences that disappeared almost as soon as they happened. A child learning a skill. A mother preparing food. A worker returning home. A fisherman watching the river. These were the quiet pieces that created a life. Later that night, when the family had finished eating, the builder stepped outside. The village was peaceful. The Nile reflected the moon. The desert remained still. He sat beside the wall of his home and listened to the sounds of the night. A distant boat moved across the water. A breeze passed through palm leaves. Someone closed a wooden door. Then silence returned. Ancient Egypt was often remembered through what was built. But what was lived mattered just as much. Behind every stone was a person. Behind every field was a family. Behind every boat was a worker. Behind every home was a story. And as the people of Egypt rested beneath the stars, the simple life beside the Nile continued quietly, carried forward through another night of gentle darkness and another morning waiting beyond the horizon. The night slowly settled over the ancient valley once more. The fields beside the Nile rested beneath a quiet sky. The day's warmth had disappeared from the earth, leaving behind only the gentle coolness of evening. The palm trees moved softly in the breeze, their leaves whispering above the sleeping villages. Inside the simple mud-brick homes, families prepared for rest. The final lamps burned low. The last pieces of bread were placed away. Tools were set beside walls, ready for another morning. The sounds of daily life became distant and soft. A fisherman secured his boat along the riverbank and walked home beneath the stars. A farmer looked once more across his fields before closing his door. A worker washed the dust from his hands after another long day beneath the Egyptian sun. Their lives were made from ordinary moments. From early mornings beside grinding stones. From footsteps on dusty roads. From the warmth of bread shared with family. From tired bodies resting after hours of work. From quiet conversations beneath the night sky. Ancient Egypt was not only a land of pyramids and temples. It was a land of people. People who woke before sunrise. People who cared for children. People who carried water. People who planted seeds and waited patiently for harvest. People who shaped stone with worn hands. People who watched the river and trusted its endless movement. Their names have mostly disappeared. Their voices have faded into the distant past. But the traces of their lives remain. They remain in the fields beside the Nile. They remain in the walls built from earth and straw. They remain in the tools left behind. They remain in the quiet spaces between the great monuments, where ordinary people once walked, worked, rested, and dreamed. The builder who carried stone beneath the sun could never know that his simple days would one day become a story remembered by people thousands of years later. The farmer who placed seeds into the soil could never know that the fields he cared for would still tell the story of human patience. The mother who prepared bread in the early morning could never know that her small routines represented the daily lives of countless families who came before and after her. They were not trying to create history. They were simply living. And perhaps that is what makes their story so peaceful. They found meaning in familiar things. In the rising sun. In the flowing river. In the evening meal. In the voices of family. In the quiet comfort of returning home after a long day. The Nile continued moving through the darkness, just as it had for generations before them and just as it would for generations after. Its waters carried memories of farmers and fishermen, builders and craftsmen, children and elders. The river remembered what people could not. It remembered footsteps along its banks. It remembered boats crossing beneath the morning sky. It remembered hands reaching into its waters. It remembered a civilization built not only from stone, but from countless small acts repeated every day. Now, as the ancient village grows quiet one final time, the lamps disappear behind closed doors. The rooftops become empty. The roads become still. The desert wind moves gently across the land. Above the Nile, the stars shine over the same valley where ordinary people once looked upward and wondered about tomorrow. Their world was simple. Their days were sometimes difficult. Their lives were often filled with work and responsibility. But they also knew moments of warmth. Moments of peace. Moments of belonging. And beneath the endless Egyptian sky, beside the slow and steady river, those forgotten lives continue to rest quietly in the pages of time. The night grows deeper. The water continues flowing. The desert remains silent. And somewhere in that ancient darkness, the echoes of simple lives slowly fade into sleep,